Okay, great. Well, once again, thank you so much for facilitating this, and I'm really honored to be presenting this here. I think the title that you gave this, "The Art of Parenting," is quite apt because it's definitely an art and not a science. What I'm going to be trying to share over the next 45 minutes or so is really lessons from three main areas. One is around my work with young people and youth over across about 30 years. Um, in addition to my work in Avanti, which is now at 12 schools and close to 6,000 children in those schools, and lessons from there. And thirdly, from my own life and my own experience in raising two kids. So I think whilst I could, you could look at that and say that's pretty anecdotal because it's not going to be statistical. Part of the message here is that actually um, that's true because it's virtually impossible to try and um, capture that in a scientific way because there is so much here that who is going to be the authority in terms of how to raise children, right? So like there's so many nuances and variables involved, and one of the messages that I often give to parents is to be able to develop a confidence and trust in your own perspective and your own instinct. So I think so. We'll start from here, and there's a lot about there's a lot of academic studies out there, and we see it a lot in education. We see it a lot in with regards to parenting. Um, but I think it's important for us to keep these things in perspective. Science has, over decades, done some pretty big U-turns on their perspectives on how to raise children. So, everything from, is breast milk better than formula milk, or the other way around, or is crying a baby to sleep the best way to do that? So there there is never going to be a one size fits all. So please take whatever I say here as really reflections, personal reflections on my journey as a parent, which I don't think is there for you to take copy paste. I think it's just for you to reflect on and see if any of this really has meaning for you. There was a really interesting study. It was around 2010, a psychology study, which was talking about how um, the psychological data, the academic data that we have based on the research that's gone on and published, 96% of that is based on individuals who have a European background. So that's quite interesting, right? Because what happens is that when you have an academic study on something like parenting or anything with regards to psychology, this was when you have that, we tend to extrapolate from those academic studies to say, well, this is human nature. This is true for if it's true for in an academic study, then it must be true across the board. Whereas in fact, um, that's not a good assumption because what this study showed, going back on the composition of the samples that they were using for these studies, 90% with European background meant that they had a really interesting acronym for it, which was WEIRD. So WEIRD. So WEIRD is W for Western, E for educated, I for industrialized, R for rich, and D for democratic. So when you put these five composites together, you see that not most of the world is from that background. So it's a real challenge, or it's a real danger to be able to kind of try and extrapolate based on that. So my view is that there's a collective wisdom that can be found in groups and conversations like this, which is why one of the reasons why I really valued being here today and being able to share some of these reflections with you is because I think the collective wisdom that arises from this and in conversation is 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 from my perspective probably better and more valuable than even expert opinion, because I think the collective wisdom amounts to more than that. So part of what I'm going to try and do is ask you a few questions, the audience, and I'm hoping what you'll be able to do is in the chat function, just just share your responses, and it won't be complicated. I'll ask you for one word answers, so hopefully real easy. And again, I'm not going to try and do a clean analysis of this. I'll just try and get a sense of what's coming through on the chat box. So with that said, let's kick off. And the first thing I wanted to speak about was now, why is that not showing? Okay, well, it looks like that's not showing. The slide's not displaying, and I'm not quite sure why. But the question I have for you. You can see it. Oh, you can. Oh, fantastic. Well, it's Teams on my end then. So I think the question you've got on there is what in one word, if I was to ask you for your children, yeah, okay, there you got it. We already started here. Happiness. So what's the one word you want for your children? So we've got happiness, health, love, happy, fulfillment, hope, well-being. Yeah. Okay, safety, happiness, peace, independence, empowerment. Okay, fantastic. So joy, very good. Confidence, love. Okay, I'm going to so I'm going to pause you there because I know there are so many people on the I can't even count the number of people on this call right now. So I won't be able to wait till I've read all of them, but you get the sense, right? And I think you will get the sense of what we're talking about here. And I think if you were when I've done this in different spaces and with different audiences, when you ask this question in an interactive space, and then you move that further and further back in terms of, okay, let's say you take something like, we've got here something like strength and resilience and independence, and then you ask them why that. So why that quality? And then and the further and further you go back, you get to something like happiness stroke love, something which is really what most people feel is very fundamental. So now I'm going to ask you a question which this might be rhetorical because we won't have time to do it on the chat. But if you think about, okay, let's say happiness, because that seems to be the most common statement on the chat. If we say that what we want from our children, what we want for our children is for them to be happy, then the question is, how will they achieve that? So what is it that will lead them or give them happiness? And one of the ways that we can think about this question is, when have you felt deeply, and I don't mean superficially happy, like, buying a gadget or some superficial relationship or any, I don't mean it from a transitory perspective, but if you think about it from the most deep, your sense of the most deep, profound sense of happiness that you've had, um, those experiences in your life, what has caused that, right? So what is it that's underpinning that? And what we often find is that it's really the opposite of what we're often chasing, right? Does that make sense? So like what we're often chasing, and what we're often chasing, whether it's in ourselves, in society, the kind of messaging that we hear, and sometimes the messaging that we also know exists in schools, and certainly to children, is not the same as what it is that we know to be true, that's underpinning our most fundamental value in terms of that deep sense of happiness. So um, there's a book called Man's Search for Meaning by an author called Viktor Frankl. It is one of my favorite books. He's a psychologist. He took extensive notes. He was actually a survivor of the Holocaust, so he was in a concentration camp. And while he was there, he was studying the response of individuals in that most tragic, um, uh, excruciatingly difficult situation. And he was looking at the responses of people, and what is it that enabled some of those individuals to feel a sense of, um, happiness. Obviously, in that context, seems ridiculous, but a sense of stability and ability to continue in their life and positivity. And what he boiled that down to was that they had a sense of spiritual foundation. That spiritual foundation enabled them, and I'm separating that from don't misinterpret that with a religious foundation. Okay, so here I'm, and we'll get to what does spiritual mean, but he honed in on this idea of a spiritual grounding, and how that was the thing which enabled some of those individuals within such difficult times to be able to continue their life in a positive perspective. So there's one, when I do teacher training, when I speak to our staff, one of the things I say to them, just to get them really sitting up in their chairs in a provocative manner, is to say to them, let's not lie to our children. And there's a risk that we do. There's a risk that we allow society to lie to our children as to what is it that will bring them to happiness. And when you're a parent, that's not as easy as it sounds to not do that, because we have a sense of what it is that will bring them stability, what it is that will bring them good grades and all of the rest of it, and being on the same kind of conveyor belt, which there is a risk of them being. So, and that's not easy to stand back from. I remember uh, when my first child was born in 2003. At that moment, when when he was born, I think it was a very real experience for me, that it was a very different experience of love that a parent has for a child than really you've experienced before. Because if we define love, and I think this is a very helpful definition of love, if we define love as that uh, that feeling and action which promotes the well-being of the person I love, i.e., of the beloved. If that's what we mean by love, that I want the best for them and I'm willing to do what it takes to enable that outcome. If that's what we mean by love, then really that's it becomes so in focus with children. And this brings us on to the point of around parenting, that this idea and trying to balance this notion that um, we love our children so much that we're willing to do anything for them. We want them to be happy and fulfilled, and yet there is this other side of the practicalities of life that we're trying to balance out. And how do we navigate that? What could be seen as a dichotomy, I personally feel it's a false dichotomy, but it could be interpreted like that. And I think that's a challenge which many parents face. So this sense of love, of wanting to the best for the individual, brings about this notion that you're not just living through them, but you're living for them. And that's a quite a profound place to be. um, and I think what gets lost in that dichotomy is that sometimes we lose the big picture, in the chaos and it is in many instances chaos of parenthood. Sometimes we could quite easily lose the big picture of what is it that I really want at its most essential level. What is it that I want for this person who is in my care? And for us not to lose sight of that most important aspect in all the fluctuations and day-to-day, you know, arguments and pressures and stress and all of these things. Um, what is it that's most important? And let me not lose sight of that, because that really will boil down to the quality of the relationship that you have with children, with your children. So that when we put that, the quality of our relationship with our children, when we put that at the forefront based on this premise that ultimately what I want for them is to be happy, when we put that quality of that relationship first, then I think wonderful things can happen. So so let's go on to speak a little bit about, and I'm going to leave time for questions at the end. So hopefully you'll be able to hold those for then. Um, okay, so now I'm going to ask you another question. One word answer, please. What do you feel are the main functions, or the main function? Let's keep it singular. What's the main function of a parent? Listening. Oh no, I'm not sure. Okay, shaping values, providing, coaching, supporting, teaching, guidance, love, promoting, enabling, nurturing, care, lead by example, safety, uh, guide, support. Sorry, I'm not capturing all. They're coming up too fast for me to read. Promoting, foundation, values. Okay, very good. Safety, teaching, being there. Okay, being available. Okay, very good. Enabling, caring. So I think preparing. Okay, that's a good one. Educating. I like that one. um, Promoting critical thinking. Okay, interesting. Okay, I'm going to move on. So here, look. Often we will think about words like protecting and providing, right? And you've got a whole bunch of other stuff which related to the previous slide, which is what is it that we want for them, i.e., love and empowerment and care and etc. But safety or protecting, if we can call it that, and providing are two things which is clear, and that's coming up here. Um, but here's a slight kind of counterintuitive point, which has come up in a different way in the chat. What about challenge? And you've got conversation. Well, you haven't got conversation specifically, I don't think, but I'm going to talk about conversation here as well, because it's interesting that one of my favorite quotes is from Michael Hopf, who says he was speaking about the cycle of society. So he said that when you have hard times, so hard times create strong men, and strong men create good times, but good times create weak men, and weak men create hard times, and so the cycle goes. And I thought this was really pertinent. It really quite interesting, because this idea of challenge, which isn't talked about so much, because what happens sometimes is that we see the role of the parent as trying to minimize discomfort and promote comfort, or minimize uh, um, potentially challenge, and to try and help them along. And one of the interesting things that I've seen, and I think we know when we reflect on it. Yeah, sorry, Christina. I'm just quoting him. He did say men, as in manus, as in mankind, but yes, men and women, I'm sure. So the question here around challenge and what is it that we want. I'll give you an anecdote. I remember when I was working in consultancy, they used to fly us around. They used to fly us around in business class. So when you're young and early in your career, flying around in business class is great, right? So um, and then when we were going on a family holiday, I was thinking, well, do you want to fly business class or fly economy? Because what I noticed in myself was, once you've flown business class, do you ever think you're going to be able to fly economy without causing a big fuss in your own mind, right? So like what happens is that sometimes when you expose somebody to comfort, what you do is so like for me, I'm completely spoiled. So like for the rest of my life now, it's an austerity to fly economy, even though that's what I do most of the time, right? So like it's such an interesting thing that sometimes we can, in the best intentions, try and provide for our children something. So in my case, it would be trying to provide comfort for my children, taking them business class. Isn't this fun? Which I didn't do, by the way, because it was far too expensive. But in the long term, what has that done? In the long term, what it's done is caused them a lifetime of pain, because they're going to have to fly economy for the rest of their life, maybe, and therefore, what is it that's really that we're doing? So there's an interesting anecdote, which a person who was in India at the time of Alexander the Great's invasion of India. His name was Chanakya, and he said something very interesting. He said between up to the age of 5, so from birth to 5, you should treat the child as a prince or a princess, and from 5 to 15, treat them as a servant, and from 15 onwards as a friend. So look, this is not supposed to be absolute truth, but let's try and see what the principle here. The principle here is that in the very early years, and we know this to be true in terms of early years, studies around early years, in the early years, that the importance of unconditional love and support from the parents to the child is so important. It's so important because it gives them such a profound sense of security. And that enables to happen is that when you then go on from, and that's not to say that you never ever discipline a child less than five, or so don't take this as kind of, written in stone. But the idea being that where is the emphasis? And then children do need parameters. They need discipline. They need rules. They want that. And we see that in terms of their own constructive development. And then that's why from 5 to 15, the idea that you give them parameters, you give them rules within which to engage with, and you give them discipline. And what's really interesting is the connection between the 0 to 5 unconditional love means that when you do introduce discipline more frequently from 5 to 15, they know that there's no doubt in their mind that this discipline is coming from a place of love because they've experienced that unconditional love from 0 to 5. And then it says after 15, basically you've done what you can, and now you need to be their friend because your discipline's not really going to work here. They're gonna hear different things from different people. So it's a beautiful kind of, I use that in my own thought process when I was parenting, and I find it quite profound. I find it really a helpful steer. Again, nothing absolute here, because after 15 they do need a friend. They need somebody that they can talk to openly and be completely, and not feel like they're under that constant pressure, because there will be time for rebelling as well. And this idea that we need to then balance this notion of what happens where I'm a parent and therefore there's a difference between me and you, and at the same time this potential tricky place which becomes where they're looking to us as role models between 5 and 15, let's say, and we're telling them something different to what we're doing, right? So when we're introducing some form of discipline because it's age appropriate, I'll give a simple example. For me, it happened when I was telling my child, who was less, he hadn't joined high school yet, that I didn't want him to have a smartphone. So you can imagine the conversation. You shouldn't have a smartphone. Yeah, why do you have a smartphone? So there's that tricky balance about, in that age group, what is it that how do we navigate that challenge? So just checking in. Yeah, okay. Thank you for the clarifications, whoever's doing that on chat. Very nice. Okay, so what makes discipline effective? Okay, so what I'm going to talk about here is really about our ability to engage with what we're actually doing. So let me give you an example. Um, when we are in control of our emotions, when we then say something to a child, disciplinary, it has a completely different effect to when we're not in control of our emotions. And I experienced this several times with my kids, where I could feel like I was saying something. I was, whether I was shouting or in anger, kind of a knee-jerk reaction, and those types of interactions. And they may listen because they have respect or whatever, but in terms of what it does, one, to the relationship, and two, to their inner understanding of discipline and how they should respond to it, it's not a good place to be. And I think it it's incumbent upon us to be really careful about how we engage with things like discipline. And one of the rules that I have for myself is that if I'm in a situation where I feel angry, I mean, my kids are 19 and 16, so it's a different situation. I'm in friend mode right now. But looking back, what I tried to do quite early on was, because I felt myself often getting into a situation where I was being, a disciplinarian, but without feeling that I was in control of that emotion. And so what I decided to do was, actually, if I felt angry or upset, I basically, I just paused on it. So I didn't engage with them. And only when I felt that and I checked in with myself and I felt like, okay, I'm completely in control of this emotion, was I then allowing myself to get involved with an action of discipline to that child, or or expressing anger in a way that I felt when I felt fully in control of that. And I think that's a really important principle for us. It's not, it's by no means easy, but definitely just the attempt is a good step forward. And being able to be clear, because how we say something, what we're thinking, and how it comes across to a child is not always straightforward, right? So I remember once when my younger one, who was a bit of a nightmare for his mother to manage, when my younger one was um, he must have been 3 or 4, so able to run relatively quickly. Um, my wife was trying to say something to him and called him towards her. He interpreted it as a bit of a frivolous, jokey interaction, so he started to move away from her. So the more she called out to him, the further he ran away. And it got to a point where she was like getting, she was getting, she was trying to be strict with him. He was interpreting it as a joke. And he ran around the house through the side gate onto the street. So I was like, like she's trying to call him back, trying to, but what her action was doing was making him run further away. And that's because of the way that he was interpreting the message. And as it happened, he actually ran onto the road. Luckily, there was a good driver on the street, and he saw peripherally that there was a child running on. So, he stopped. But the point being that how, like, the clarity with which we need to express ourselves to children, aligned with our body language and everything else, is a key part of how discipline plays out. Okay, so let's move on. Let's talk a bit about stressful, right? Because I think one of the things that um, one of the things that I hear a lot from parents, particularly young parents, is how stressful it can be, and sometimes how lonely it can be. And part of this is that um, the way that we parent now in terms of society, the societal changes that have happened over decades and centuries, have changed the structure of what parenting involves. And part of our society also has this, we have a culture of trying to control very small things, and that's a very high pressured situation where we're trying to control every small thing. And then when you introduce a child into the situation, it becomes a million times harder because the child is very difficult to control and not meant to be controlled, right? So there's no license that we get as a parent. There's no, well, this is a good example of an engagement or a conversation around it. But how do we learn to parent? Like, where do we get our qualification or licensing from to parent? And historically, it would be contextual. So there would be extended families, or there would be a broader structure where, as a teenager, or an older sibling or whatever, you would be very closely associated and involved with parenting. So you would actually get your apprenticeship, if you like, in parenting from your own experience while you were younger. Whereas with the kind of moving away from extended families and that communal type living, that's pretty much gone. So the first experience many people have with parenting is them being a parent, and that's not always easy. So because you're having to learn real fast. So and another bit is around the separation of our life with the child's life. So as opposed to integration, right? So like historically, a child would be very much involved and integrated within that within within their parents' life. Whereas now, everything's pretty much different, right? So their social world is different. The kind of engagement on things like chores and their entertainment, and the work and versus school, and all of that is very much separated out. And large family social structures lead to, and all of this leads to, quite isolated parenthood. And that part of isolation um, is is a real cause of stress. And when you add on top of that all of the other things that we're trying to do in terms of trying to control stuff, like I mean, again, my own example, I remember when when my kids were first starting to go to school, one of the most stressful points in the day, wasn't at work. It was getting the children ready to leave on time to go to school. So that was one of the most, and it caused stress not just between me and the child, but also between my wife and the child, between me and my wife. You know, it was just a stressful environment for the home. And that's, again, it's just like, it's completely unnecessary. So one day, just like completely fed up with that whole routine, we just decided, like, let's just take a natural consequences approach to this, which in this situation meant that we explained to my older one at the time, which was who was related to say that, look, this is the time you need to be ready, um, and we're not gonna force you to get ready, but if you're not ready, you'll be late for school. And you wouldn't believe this, well, maybe you will believe it, but the fact is, that day onwards, not once have we ever said to any of the children, to either of the children, sorry, got two, either of the children, to hurry up and get ready, because we've left it to them. And interestingly, not once have they been late. So, that sense of ownership that they then take as a outcome of natural consequence is something that I think that we we could really benefit from doing ourselves. Okay. So talking a bit about children learning, right? So how do children learn? Um, this again, I read this and I cannot remember where, but it's a very ancient text. Uh, it's one of the Upanishads, but forgive me, I can't remember right now. Oh no, no, sorry, it's from the Mahabharata. So in the Mahabharata, it gives an example. It gives an assessment of how do children learn. So the question is, how do children learn? Um, so what, I just saw the chat doesn't work with the daughter. She continues to be late. Okay, well, we'll come back to that maybe. So how is it? How do children learn? So often we would look at by example and instruction, right? So by example is one of the most effective ways of learning. I've seen some of these things on the chat as well. So by example is a key piece, and the word um, in Sanskrit is acharya, which means by example. That's the role of a teacher, that you teach by example, and not just in any form of teaching. So 25% or one quarter is by the teacher's the Mahabharata says 25% is by the teacher's instruction and their example. 25%. Most people would give that a much higher percentage. 25%, it says, is in discussion with others. So this is an interesting point because we use this a lot in education, right? So in school contexts, and this notion of the importance of actually being in a school context where you're surrounded by others that you can engage with. So if 25% is through the elder or the teacher's instruction example, 25% in discussion with others, 25% by their own reflection. So another quarter by their own reflection, their own thinking about what it is that they're trying to learn. Again, an interesting point. And all three of these bits are ones that we use in education. But the fourth one is not one that we really think about a lot. And that last 25%, the Mahabharata says, is by the passage of time. So just the role of time, of being able to of that maturity and that ability of something to sit with somebody before it comes to fruition in their minds as their own. And I thought that was, again, a really interesting thing, because sometimes when we're thinking about what we teach a child, that importance of actually giving them the space to actually let something sit with them without having to force it through. And, you know, uh, believe me, I work, as you know now, in the education sector, and there is a constant push and drive towards progress and attainment and grade, and all of that, I believe, is good and necessary, but it's not everything. It's not the only way children will learn, and we need to be alive to that. And and they also learn differently as they grow older, right? As many of you will know. So in primary school, for example, we see you can ask children to do something and they'll be enthusiastic and happily comply with almost anything that you ask them to do. and they're fully engaged. And as they get to high school and teenage years, it's a very different dynamic, and you have to do something differently. And in that situation, one of the things that really becomes very important is the role of their peers, of course, and their own ownership, like their own taking responsibility of their own learning. Because once you have that, uh, it, it that's a that they need to grow into that space for them to be involved and engaged, as opposed to just relying on either others or external. And again, another really important concept is, we know that there are different types of intelligences, right? So different children will have different forms of intelligence, where they, so visual, auditory, kinesthetic, etc., in terms of how they learn best. But there's also something about their own nature and propensities, um, which is a challenge for education and the education system, because the education system is quite uniform, and often because of the limitations of funding or whatever else, it's actually difficult to deliver a personalized um, program of education. So, in the Vedic tradition, one of the one of the interesting concepts was to determine and nurture a growing child's propensity. Different members of the community would come together to discuss that child. So that would include the adult, sorry, the parents, an older sibling, a teacher, a community elder, a close friend, and like that, you would get almost a consortium of well-intentioned individuals who loved this child, who wanted the best for this child, and who would come together to discuss, what is this child like? What are their propensities in the different contexts that we um, experience them in? And at different points in that growing child's life, they would come together to help guide the form of experience and education that the child would be exposed to enable them to really flourish in their own nature and propensity. Now, I mean, like theoretically, that is it's an extremely powerful idea, and it's it's something which, I really hope that we can bring back into the education system. And we're starting to experiment with a few things in Avanti to see how we can make that happen. But again, like I said, I think it's got lots of potential. And yeah, so let's move on. I'm just a little conscious of time because I do want to leave time for questions. This was an interesting point that came up in a recent conference that we had, and it's so they this was presented by an education institution in the UK, who what they found was that they have an all through school where they were educating kids from 4 up to 18, so up until just before university college. Throughout their education career, many of these children are getting really good grades throughout their school career. They get into college or university, and they experience a real dip. Now, obviously, there are many different factors which could play into that. But when you exclude all the circumstantial factors, including things like mental health and drop in levels of confidence, etc. One of the things that they honed in on and that shone through to them was that the the one common factor which was there with those children who did struggle post school and post that more structured environment with parents was the quality of relationships that they had. So the quality of conversations that they'd experienced and the quality of relationships that had cultivated, and where that wasn't strong, um, that was difficult. It was difficult for them to continue on. And this was an eye opener for many, because often in schools, if you think about it in terms of the different stages, right, of schooling. So before school, people think, well, one of the things that we may think is success looks like getting them into the school I want them to get into. And the school thinks, the primary or the lower school thinks success is getting them educated enough to get into the high school that they want to go into. And the high school thinks success is getting them into the college they want to go into. And the college thinks success is getting them into the career that they want to get into. But remember what we asked right in the beginning, right? What is success? What is the thing that we really want them to get? what is a real thing that we want for them. And so it was interesting that that this was a, that one of the important things that we need to be able to build them and grow them with in terms of a foundation for their long-term success is the healthy nature of the relationships they have, right? So and in today's day and age where we're seeing so much rise in terms of mental health and issues and concerns with children and their well-being, etc., and how that grows, this is even more important. So the focus on the conversation as a parent, one of the most important things that we can do in terms of being responsive to them when they need it and being engaged in that conversation, that quality conversation with them. Look, time's often a limitation for most of us, right? But the point is that if time, given that time is going to be a constraint, how do we make sure that the time that we do spend with them is not distracted and is engaged with them and is engaged in the conversation that, many parents say to ask me, like, what can I do to help my children in school? What can I help to, help their progress? What can I do? What kind of, workbooks should I be doing with them, or courses or whatever? And the one thing I say to everyone again and again and again, just spend time on the conversation. Just invest in the conversation. That will do more than you can possibly imagine. Um, because it will do so many things for them in terms of their own support, their own well-being, their own ability to be honest with you and frank with you whenever, whatever it might be, for them to be able to approach you. And in the long term, through the difficult times that no doubt will come through primary school, but more in high school, and then even more potentially in college, um, that they have a safe place to come back to. And that's around things like, even simple things like eating together, like some of the cultures around what we do together as a family or as parent-child relationship, something that we really need to be conscious of. And this is my last slide before we move on to questions. And here I'm introducing this notion I said at the beginning and referred to Viktor Frankl, this idea of, you know, uh, what it is that when we say spiritual and what is that grounding, you know, one of the interesting texts that I come across was in the Bhagavad Purana. It says one of the opening lines is, the highest knowledge, or knowledge, is reality distinguished from illusion for the welfare of all. And this idea of reality distinguished from illusion really struck a chord with me. And it's interesting that, remember this weird acronym from the beginning, this Western educated, industrialized, rich and democratic, this kind of microcosm that we live in. This idea um, that that form of upbringing and education um, will be the best outcome. It's very interesting because studies have shown that even simple things like visual illusions, those children who are brought up close to nature, outside of a very kind of unnatural environment, so in more distant from nature environments, are more susceptible. This weird kind of group are more susceptible to even simple things like visual illusions. So this idea that of being closer to nature and being closer to a natural way of living in a natural world enables our ability to engage with things in their reality, in distance from and separating it out from illusion, a higher form of complexity. So, in a complex world, that's what we want people to be able to, and our children to be able to think really clearly and to get to the heart of something. So, this idea of spirituality, when we talk about it in schools, we think about it in four different ways. One is around identity. So, of all the different layers of identity that we have, what is our core identity at its most fundamental level? And how do I fix myself in that identity so I'm less susceptible to external validation and the importance of that, and I care more about the opinions of people who really love me and who I love. So one's about identity. The second one is the state of our consciousness. Like, what is it that enables me? And let's call that any form of practice or habit which enables me to raise the quality of my consciousness. So that's what we also define as spiritual. It's raising my quality of consciousness, and that will be different for different people, and for children to be able to experience and experiment with that. And then there's this idea that spirituality can also be a buffer to uh, materialism. This idea that whether it's consumerism or materialism or whatever else you might think, but let's talk about it as very superficial engagement with the world, that spirituality can be something that's a bit more grounding. And the fourth point is around spirituality being related to, for them to find their own sense of deep purpose. And, you know, in this light, so those four again, so one is about identity, the second one is about consciousness, the third one is around a buffer to materialism, and the fourth one is finding their own sense of purpose in life. Now, these are four principles which we found are, you know, completely inclusive. Anybody can engage with that, whether you're from a faith background or a non-faith background or whatever, wherever you might be on that spectrum or any other spectrum, that they can engage with that. And that's the type of spirituality which, um, you know, I see in Viktor Frankl's work. And this relates with the practical things that we have to do, right? So like everything from how things like food and the nature of how does food impact on these areas of, say, consciousness and our well-being. So in Avanti, for example, we have vegetarian meals across all of our schools. They're healthy, they're cooked on site. We know for many of our children this is the most important meal of the day that they'll have, etc. So even things that as simple as what you're cooking at home and what you're sharing at home, all the way through to the more kind of more obvious examples of engagement with spirituality, like we've developed our own, developing, I should say, our own curriculum for meditation and yoga, to help again children learn habits and tools and skills of spiritual practice and connection. So these are some of the things that we're doing, and I think and I hope this has been some food for thought. As I said, certainly nothing here that should be taken as written in stone, but some ideas hopefully that will trigger some conversation or some reflection for you. So thank you once again for participating, and again my thanks to Sapna and the team for facilitating. I'll pause now, and if there are any questions, and if we've got time, happy to take them.